The rain began before sunset, a thin mist at first, then a downpour that erased the lines between sky and earth. Inside the ward residence, every window gleamed with reflections of water and light, a modern masterpiece of glass and steel, designed by its owner, Graham Ward, the man the architectural world once called a visionary. But tonight, the lights were too bright. The silence inside was too sharp. Elena Ward stood at the edge of the kitchen counter, her hands trembling over a half-finished glass of red wine. The air smelled faintly of cedar and turpentine, the scent that clung to her husband's work. Upstairs, she could hear him pacing in his studio, slow and measured like a metronome marking time for an argument yet to begin. She had told herself she would leave tonight, that she would pack the bag she'd hidden behind the guest room dresser, take the car and drive until the city disappeared behind her. But leaving Graham was never that simple. He was not the kind of man one simply walked away from. He was a man who designed everything around him, including her life. The first thunder rolled. She flinched. A moment later, Graham's voice came down the stairs, calm and deliberate. "You left the studio unlocked again." Elena froze. "I didn't go in there," she said quietly. "The lights were on," he replied, "and the draft table was moved." His tone was not angry, not even cold. It was calculating, like a craftsman inspecting a flaw in his work. She turned toward him as he entered the kitchen. He was still in his work clothes, rolled sleeves, charcoal smudges on his forearms, eyes too steady to belong to a man who ever lost control. The rain drummed against the windows, but his voice cut through it easily. "You've been avoiding me." "I've been tired," she said. "You've been somewhere else lately." A long silence stretched between them. He looked at her wine glass, at the crimson ring it left on the marble counter, and then at her hands. "You're shaking," he said. "Because I'm scared," she answered. For the first time, his face changed. Not with remorse, but with curiosity, like a designer studying a fragile structure before it collapses. Scared of what? Of what happens when someone stops following your plans. The words seemed to hang there, swallowed by thunder. Graham's jaw tightened slightly. Then, with unnerving calm, he reached for a napkin, wiped the counter, and said, "You've been in my files again." She didn't deny it. She couldn't. 2 nights ago, while he slept, she had gone into his studio and opened the drawer he always locked. Inside, she had found sketches, blueprints of their home, meticulously detailed but with strange markings in red ink, circles around her bedroom door, arrows leading from the kitchen to the patio. A note scribbled in the corner, "Elena, exit sequence." She had stared at it for hours, trying to convince herself it was harmless, an architect's habit of reimagining his own space, but deep down she knew what it meant. He had been planning something. Now, standing across from him, she whispered, "You designed it, didn't you?" He blinked once. "Designed what?" "Whatever it is you think will happen tonight." For a moment, neither moved. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the glass walls. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, faint, lost in the storm. Elena backed away toward the hallway. "I'm leaving," she said, more to herself than to him. "I can't breathe here anymore." Graham didn't follow. He simply stood still, eyes fixed on her. "If you walk out that door," he said, "you'll regret it." "I already do," she whispered. She grabbed her coat from the rack, slipped her phone into her pocket, and reached for the handle. Her fingers touched the cold metal and froze. Mud. There was mud smeared across the inside of the door, as if someone had come in from the rain, not out. She turned. "Who else is here?" He tilted his head slightly, as though the question amused him. "No one," he said softly. "Just us, like always." Her pulse quickened. Something was wrong, not in his words, but in how calm they were. She glanced toward the back window. The patio light flickered. A shadow moved briefly across the garden. Tall, uncertain, human. Elena's breath caught. "Graham?" But when she turned back, he was gone. Only the half-empty wine glass remained, trembling faintly from the vibration of the thunder. Hours later, the storm cleared. At 2:14 a.m., a neighbor called the police after hearing a woman's scream followed by glass breaking. Officers arrived to find the front door ajar, the lights still on, and the faint echo of music playing upstairs, one of Graham's old jazz records spinning endlessly on the turntable. Elena was nowhere to be found. Detectives noted a toppled wine glass near the counter, 2 sets of muddy footprints by the back door, and blood, small deliberate smears leading toward the studio. Inside the studio, they found an open blueprint on the drafting table. It wasn't of a new project, it was of this house. The red ink circles marked the kitchen, the back door, and, chillingly, the very spot where Elena's blood now glistened. When questioned, Graham appeared composed, almost serene. "My wife's been under stress," he told the officers. "She left after an argument. She does that sometimes." They asked about the blood. He smiled faintly. "I cut my hand earlier. Architects work with blades, and it happens." No one believed him, but without a body, without a witness, there was little they could do. The case was logged as a missing person, not a homicide. Still, one rookie officer lingered as they prepared to leave. His flashlight traced the edge of the blueprint, catching on something faint beneath the layers of pencil and ink. A sentence, almost erased. "Every design hides its flaw." He didn't mention it. He thought it was just an artist's note. Outside, the rain began again, washing away footprints and blood alike. In the reflection of the studio window, Graham's face appeared, calm, expressionless, and waiting. Somewhere beyond that glass, hidden by darkness and thunder, Elena Ward was gone. And the house he had designed for her was finally complete. Back at the precinct that evening, Ruth reviewed the case files again. Elena Ward, 32, part-time art teacher, no record, no family in state. Married to Graham for 6 years. Friends described them as private but loving. No history of abuse reported. Yet there were texts, short frantic messages Elena had sent to an unknown number 3 nights before her disappearance. "He's planning something. It's in his drawings. If anything happens, check the designs." Ruth leaned back, rubbing her temples. She'd seen plenty of manipulative husbands, but Graham Ward wasn't impulsive. He was methodical, calculated. Whatever happened to Elena had been built, designed. She replayed the interview in her mind, the cadence of his voice, the way he never once said missing and only left. There was one phrase that stuck with her. "Architecture is about trust." She muttered it aloud, almost tasting the irony. Then she opened the evidence folder again, her eyes landing on a new photo taken by forensics that afternoon. The underside of the main blueprint, top sheet. There was a faint imprint pressed into the paper by a harder pencil. When magnified, the words became visible. Stage 2, concealment chamber. Ruth's stomach turned cold. She returned to the Ward residence at dusk. The yellow tape was gone now, the property sealed and silent. She let herself in using the warrant, flashlight cutting through the darkened hall. The floorboards creaked under her boots. In the studio, she found what she'd been searching for, the drawer beneath the drafting table. Inside, dozens of rolled-up blueprints, each labeled with a date and title. But one stood out. The label simply read, Version E, Ward House. She unrolled it slowly. Unlike the others, this version contained annotations not in pencil, but in deep red ink. The layout was the same, except for one additional detail, a small windowless room behind the library, marked with a single word. Hidden. Ruth stared at it for a long time. The hum of the storm outside had returned, whispering against the glass. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard groaned, or maybe it was just the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in the silence. She folded the blueprint, tucking it under her arm as she headed for the stairs. At the threshold, she paused and looked back at the immaculate studio. The clean lines, the still drying ink, the empty drafting chair. "Every design hides its flaw," she murmured. As she stepped out into the rain, she didn't notice the faint red light blinking from a small camera above the studio doorway. Recording, watching, waiting. The morning after Elena Ward's disappearance, the sky over Ridgefield Heights was washed in gray. Detective Ruth Marlowe arrived just after 8, pulling her coat tight against the cold. The elegant home of the city's most admired architect was framed in yellow tape. The report was routine. Domestic dispute, missing wife, no forced entry. But something felt wrong. The crime scene photos didn't look accidental, they looked arranged. Inside the house was immaculate, paused in time. Graham Ward, the husband, was in his studio, cool and cooperative. "My wife has been struggling," he said smoothly. "Paranoia. She imagined I was planning to hurt her." Ruth noticed a blueprint on his table. "A private commission," Graham explained. But as she looked closer, she saw a small red circle marked by the kitchen, identical to a detail in the crime scene photos. "A drainage point," he said. "And blood?" she asked. His smile faltered for just a second. Later, alone in the studio, Ruth found a miniature model of the house. And there in the tiny kitchen was a red dot. Not paint. It was dried blood. He wasn't hiding it, he was displaying it. The rain hadn't stopped. It never really did in Ridgefield Heights. It only shifted moods. This morning, it fell in a fine silver mist, veiling the Ward residence in quiet grief. Detective Ruth Marlowe arrived before dawn, coffee in hand, search warrant in her coat pocket. The house loomed like a mausoleum, still sealed, still waiting. She stood on the front steps for a moment, watching her breath rise in the cold, then unlocked the door. Inside, the air was stale, dust already gathering on polished surfaces, the faint trace of turpentine still lingering from Graham's studio upstairs. She could almost hear the echo of their first conversation, his measured voice, her restrained suspicion. Now she was here for proof. She walked slowly down the hallway toward the library, flashlight beam cutting across the floorboards. The library was Graham's sanctuary, a cavern of oak shelves and sterile precision. Not a single book out of place, not a speck of dust. The kind of perfection that only looked natural if you'd rehearsed it. She glanced at the blueprint she'd brought, version E. There it was again, the extra room, no door, no windows, just a narrow rectangle hidden behind the west wall. Ruth crouched near the shelf marked on the drawing. The flashlight revealed faint drag marks along the floor. Her fingers traced the edge of the wood, smooth but not seamless. She pressed gently. A click sounded beneath her hand. The shelf shifted. The entire section of books trembled forward by half an inch, releasing a gust of cold, stale air. "Jesus," she muttered. She pushed harder, and the wall swung open on a concealed hinge. Behind it was a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Ruth flicked on her secondary flashlight and started down. Each step groaned under her weight. The walls closed in, raw concrete and steel beams, unfinished, clinical. It wasn't a basement, it was a bunker. At the bottom, the narrow passage opened into a small chamber, square and windowless. The air smelled faintly of metal and mildew. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, bolted to the floor. Facing it, a camera mounted on a tripod. Her beam moved across the wall, catching rows of pinned photographs fluttering slightly in the draft. Dozens of them. Elena Ward's face stared back at her from everyone, bound, bruised, eyes wide with fear. Ruth's throat tightened. She stepped closer, forcing herself to study the images. The timestamps were recent, days after Elena's reported disappearance. "Oh God, Elena." She pulled out her phone and began taking photos of everything. The room, the camera, the chair, the clock in the corner that had stopped at 2:14 a.m., the same time the neighbor had heard the scream. But what caught her attention most wasn't Elena's expression. It was the composition. Each image was perfectly lit, perfectly framed, as if designed by an artist obsessed with balance and symmetry. Even in terror, Graham's precision persisted. A low hum filled the air. She turned sharply, flashlight sweeping across the floor. A small red light blinked beneath the chair. A motion sensor. Before she could react, a faint mechanical whir rose from the corner. The camera clicked to life. "Detective Marlowe," came a voice from behind her. She spun around, hand on her gun. Graham Ward stood at the top of the stairs, calm as a man giving a house tour. He wore the same gray shirt as before, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be down here," he said. "This is evidence," she snapped. "A hidden room on your property." 2 hours later, the forensics team filled the house. Officers marked evidence, bagged photographs, dismantled the camera. Ruth stood outside under the porch, watching the rain gather along the roof's edge. Officer Harlan joined her. "You think he did it?" Ruth's jaw tightened. "He built the stage, but I don't think he was the director." "Then who?" She looked back toward the house. Through the window she could see Graham sitting calmly at the kitchen table, hands folded, a faint smile on his face as if admiring his own work. "Someone who knows his language," she said. "Someone who speaks in design." That evening, Ruth sat alone in her office reviewing the photos again. The reflection in the background haunted her. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred. The woman's face was partially obscured, but what she could see was unmistakable. Dark lipstick, pearls, and the faint edge of a gallery tag pinned to her blouse. She checked the metadata embedded in the image file. The photograph wasn't taken by a personal camera. The data listed the source as Cross Visual Archives. Ruth froze. Cross. The name surfaced in her memory. Marion Cross, an art curator and Graham's longtime patron. A woman who'd commissioned multiple architectural pieces from him. A woman whose name appeared in Elena's final phone records. Ruth stared at the glowing screen, the reflection of Elena's terrified eyes overlapping her own. "Designed to kill," she whispered. She reached for her phone and dialed forensics. "I need every connection between Graham Ward and Marion Cross. Business, personal, anything. She's involved, I can feel it." "You think she helped him?" the analyst asked. Ruth hesitated. "No," she said slowly. "I think he helped her." By nightfall, the evidence was sealed. The hidden room would be reconstructed and examined, but Ruth already knew what the findings would say. The photos were authentic, the timestamps real, and Elena's blood confirmed. And yet, Graham hadn't flinched once. She closed her notebook and looked out the precinct window. Across the city skyline, lights shimmered like stars trapped behind glass, the kind of perfection Graham might admire. Somewhere among them she imagined another mind at work, another set of hands sketching a design that wasn't finished yet. The storm returned, whispering against the glass. Ruth's reflection merged with the city lights. "Every design hides its flaw," she murmured again. "I just have to find hers." Rain drummed against the station's windows the next morning, thin streaks of light slicing through the gloom. Detective Ruth Marlowe sat hunched over her desk. Photographs of Elena's bruised face spread before her like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. The discovery of the hidden room had changed everything. What began as a missing person case was now something colder, calculated. But what gnawed at Ruth most wasn't Graham Ward's silence. It was the precision. Every nail, every angle, every camera placement had purpose. Design. And then came the file. "Financials from Ward's accounts," Officer Mills said, setting a folder on Ruth's desk. "There's something you'll want to see." Inside were transaction logs, wire transfers from someone named Marion Cross. Each payment labeled only as consultation fee. The amounts were staggering. "Cross," Ruth murmured. The name felt familiar. She opened her laptop and typed it into the database. The results flashed across the screen. Marion Cross, 58, art curator, patron of the Ward Architectural Collective, resident of Bayview Heights. Ruth leaned back, exhaling slowly. A patron, a financier, but something else too. An invisible hand that had guided Graham's career from the shadows. The Cross estate loomed over the water like a temple of glass and steel, reflecting a fractured sky. Ruth's boots clicked on the marble floor as she entered. Every surface gleamed. Art installations, twisted sculptures, suspended shapes, filled the space with silent menace. A woman descended the grand staircase, her steps measured, her posture immaculate. Silver hair swept back, lips painted the color of wine. "Detective Marlowe," she greeted, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "How unexpected." "Miss Cross, I'm investigating the disappearance of Elena Ward," Ruth said, holding her gaze. "Your name appeared in Graham Ward's financial records." Marion's expression barely shifted. "Ah, Graham. Always so brilliant, so tortured." She smiled faintly. "Our collaborations were strictly professional. Architectural commissions? In a manner of speaking. I fund genius, I curate vision. Graham had both." Her tone was effortless, but Ruth caught it. That flicker of control, the way she said had, as if Graham were no longer her equal. "Did you know Elena Ward?" Ruth asked. Marion's eyes glided to a painting on the far wall, a woman rendered in abstract strokes, faceless yet familiar. "I met her once," she said. "A pleasant woman, though I imagine life with Graham wasn't easy." "Why do you say that?" Marion's smile thinned. "Because artists like Graham build cages for themselves, and for everyone who loves them." Ruth's attention drifted to the sketches lining the gallery walls. She froze. Among the curated chaos were drawings unmistakably similar to Graham's blueprints, floor plans, structural layouts, and one, in particular, mirrored the Ward residence. The living room, the back corridor, even the hidden library wall. She stepped closer. "These are Graham's designs." Marion tilted her head. "Inspired by, perhaps. We often exchanged ideas. But this one..." Ruth's finger traced the small red circle inked near the study, the exact place where blood had been found in the Ward home. This was drawn before Elena vanished. Marion's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Coincidence, detective. Architects reuse motifs just as painters reuse colors." Ruth studied her. The poise was impeccable, too impeccable. Marion Cross wasn't just funding Graham. She was shaping him. Back at the precinct, Ruth replayed her recorder, the conversation echoing in the sterile light of her office. "Architects build cages." Marion's words repeated like a warning. Ruth spread out the photos again, Graham's sketches, the hidden room, the chair, the bruises on Elena's wrists. Then she opened a second file. Cross-estate security permits. It revealed something she didn't expect. Graham had visited the estate 6 times in the past 2 months, including the night before Elena disappeared. Her pulse quickened. 2 days later, Ruth returned to the Cross estate with a warrant. This time, Marion didn't meet her with a smile. "This is harassment," Marion snapped, standing rigid in her silk robe as officers fanned out through the gallery. Ruth ignored her. She approached a painting at the far end of the hall, a large canvas depicting geometric chaos in shades of black and gray. Behind it, a hidden latch clicked. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow passageway leading to a private room. The air inside was cold. Dust hung in pale beams of light. On a table sat a portfolio of architectural sketches. Ruth opened it and felt her stomach twist. Each drawing was a blueprint of violence. Not just the Ward home, but others. Spaces that could conceal, restrain, erase. Rooms with no exits. Staircases leading to walls. Soundproof chambers disguised as studios. And then she found the last page, a design labeled Project E. It was a rendering of the Ward residence annotated in Graham's precise handwriting, but beneath it, in a different script, looping, elegant, were Marion's words, "Perfection requires sacrifice." Ruth stared at the inscription, her mind spinning. The lines between architect and patron, lover and conspirator, blurred into something grotesque. She turned to Marion, who stood in the doorway, eyes gleaming. "You helped him," Ruth said quietly. "You designed this with him." Marion's lips curved into a thin smile. "Detective, you misunderstand. I didn't help him, I created him." That night, Ruth sat in her car overlooking the bay, the city lights shivering on the water. She played back Marion's last words, the tone, proud, almost maternal. It wasn't love that bound her to Graham. It was control. But something didn't fit. If Marion had orchestrated the design, where was Graham's hand now? And the photographs, the ones of Elena taken after her disappearance. Who had taken them? Her phone buzzed. Officer Mills again. "Detective, you'll want to hear this," he said. "We just ran analysis on the timestamps from those photos. The metadata shows they weren't taken in the ward house." Ruth's breath caught. "Where then?" He hesitated. "Coordinates trace back to Bayview Heights." Her grip tightened around the phone. The Cross Estate. She looked back toward the looming silhouette across the water. Marion S. house glowing faintly through the fog. The reflection in the glass almost looked like a blueprint. Perfect. Symmetrical. Hiding its rot beneath the surface. Hours later, Ruth sat in the observation room, watching through the glass as Graham signed his statement. His confession tied everything together. Marion's manipulation, the obsessive blueprints, the exhibition's symbolism. But something still felt unfinished. The coordinates from the photos, the ones showing Elena alive, hadn't to match the Ward home or the Cross Estate. There was another location, one she hadn't found. She opened her notebook, flipping to the sketch she'd copied from the exhibition's floor plan. A tiny marking under the glass structure caught her eye. A small circle near the corner labeled Foundation Room. Her breath hitched. It wasn't decorative, it was architectural. A hidden chamber beneath the installation. The next morning, before dawn, Ruth returned to the museum. Security hesitated, but one flash of her badge and a few choice words opened the doors. The gallery was silent now, stripped of its crowd and glamour. She stood before the glass structure, its pristine walls gleaming under the emergency lights. Then she knelt, tracing the engraved phrase with her fingers. Perfection demands sacrifice. Behind the inscription, her flashlight caught something, a faint seam along the floor, a hidden hatch. Ruth pried it open, heart pounding. A cold gust of air rose from the darkness below. A ladder descended into shadow. The museum had been silent for months. Dust coated the marble floors, soft and gray, muffling the echoes that once belonged to champagne glasses and whispered admiration. The glass structure, the infamous design of perfection, was gone, dismantled after the trial. All that remained was an empty hall and the lingering ghost of applause that had turned to disgust once the truth came out. Detective Ruth Marlowe stood at the center of it all, her reflection fractured in the faint light that filtered through the skylight above. She hadn't meant to come back, but something about the space had called to her. Unfinished business, perhaps, or the weight of the story that still felt unresolved, even after the convictions. Graham Ward was gone, found hanging in his holding cell 2 weeks after his confession. Marion Cross was behind bars awaiting sentencing, her name now synonymous with manipulation and madness. It should have been over. And yet as Ruth stared at the empty hall, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still inside the design. Her footsteps echoed softly as she made her way toward the far end of the room. A faint rectangle of dust stood out on the wall, where one of Marion S.'s last installations had hung. The janitors had missed something there. A narrow tube of rolled parchment lay tucked into the corner, sealed with a red wax emblem. Ruth crouched, frowning. The seal bore Marion's initials, M.C. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she broke the seal and unrolled the paper. It wasn't just any blueprint. It was a floor plan, drawn in Graham Ward's unmistakable architectural hand, precise and deliberate. The details were painfully familiar. A living room with a long couch, a desk by the window, a coffee table scarred with ring stains, a bedroom with a single window facing the city skyline, a narrow kitchen, barely wide enough for one person. Ruth's breath hitched. It was her apartment. At the bottom corner, written in Marion's elegant cursive, were 3 words that made the blood drain from her face. Final Design, Ruth Marlowe. And around her bed, marked in deep crimson ink, was a circle. That night Ruth sat in her apartment, the blueprint spread across her coffee table. Every inch of it was correct, down to the crack in the hallway plaster and the old radiator she'd been meaning to replace. The logical part of her mind told her it was coincidence. The emotional part whispered otherwise. Marion was in a high-security facility. There was no way she could have drawn this after her arrest, which meant someone else had. Someone who had access to Ruth's home. Her eyes scanned the red markings again. Around the bed, the window, the door, each labeled in neat, identical handwriting. Entry, observation, point of silence. She traced the words with her fingertip, her heart thudding harder. Whoever drew this knew more than just her address. They knew her movements, her habits, her routines. A faint knock startled her. She reached for her gun instinctively before realizing it was only Officer Mills at the door carrying a folder. "Sorry, Detective. Didn't mean to spook you." "You didn't," she lied, folding the blueprint quickly. Mills stepped inside, glancing around. "You okay? You've been off since the trial ended." "Just tired." He hesitated. "We got a report from the prison this morning about Marion." Ruth's head snapped up. "What about her?" "She's been different. Keeps drawing, sketches, diagrams, nothing coherent. But the guards say she mutters your name sometimes." Ruth exhaled slowly. "She's playing games." "Maybe. But there's something else. A visitor came to see her last week." "Who?" "Not family. No record of the appointment either. Just a man in a maintenance uniform. Security footage caught him entering but not leaving. It's like he vanished." Ruth felt the chill crawl up her spine. "Send me the footage." Mills nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Ruth unfolded the blueprint again, staring at the circle around her bed. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, ghostly and tired. For the first time in years, the detective felt truly watched. The footage arrived an hour later. Ruth opened it on her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly. The grainy clip showed Marion sitting in the visitor's room, her posture straight, her face serene. Across from her sat a man, tall, wearing a cap, his back to the camera. Marion leaned forward, whispering something. The man didn't move. Then, as the guard looked away, Marion reached across the table and pressed a small folded note into his palm. The timestamp flickered, and the next frame was empty. The man was gone. Ruth paused the video and zoomed in on the edge. The clock read 2:47 a.m. when Ruth finally stood from the couch, exhaustion hanging heavy in her limbs. The city outside her window was silent, distant. She turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the street lamps cutting through the blinds. The blueprint still lay on the table, its red markings glinting faintly in the dim light. She walked to the window, staring out at the city she'd spent her life protecting. A city that suddenly felt foreign, constructed, designed. A faint sound made her turn. A soft creak, like weight shifting on wood. Her heart clenched. "Who's there?" she called, her voice low but steady. No answer. She moved toward the sound, gun raised, scanning the shadows. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, and then she saw it, her reflection in the glass. But something was wrong. There was another shape behind it. Faint, motionless, human. A figure standing in the dark behind her, blurred by the reflection of the city lights. Ruth spun around, gun aimed, but the room was empty. Only silence. Her eyes darted toward the blueprint again. The red circle around her bed seemed darker now, wet, almost bleeding into the paper. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A voice, calm, quiet, measured, whispered through the line. "Every design needs a flaw, detective. You're mine." The call ended. Ruth stood frozen, the city's glow flickering against her face. Slowly, she turned back to the window. Outside on the opposite building, a faint red laser dot shimmered against her curtain, a perfect circle around her silhouette. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The circle pulsed once, then disappeared into the night. Somewhere out there, another architect was still drawing, and the next design had already begun.